So we're going to start. Yeah, you should have all heard recording in progress. We've set it up so the video part only shows us so that we don't have to impinge on your privacy or require people to sign various kind of legal documents allowing us to use your image. And almost all of our programs are being recorded and are going to be available on our uh, eventually on our website, which is being built now in a library format, where if you're a subscriber, you can go in and listen to any lecture. Uh, and we announce when the video is ready. And if you want to listen to a different course that you're not subscribed to, let us know. We can give you the password. So first of all, welcome to all of you. This is really a thrilling moment for the two of us, particularly for the roughly 15 other people who have been involved in a Jewish resurrection. When the old Lair House Judaica Hamakom closed at the end of June, a bunch of us got together and said to ourselves, you know, resurrection really worked well for the Christian church. Let's try it on us. So we resurrected Lair House Judaica under a new name, simply New Lair House, which is what it is. And we've had a tremendous response from the community, shown in the hundreds of people who have subscribed to our website, the hundreds of people who have signed up for programs and courses, and all of you who are here, and also over 50 people who volunteered to teach, almost all of them pro bono, because they want to see this kind of learning be available throughout the whole community. We're very much focused around the Bay Area, but thanks to Zoom, um, well, as we'll show you in a minute, people can join from anywhere. We have two people from Boston, Avner and Rosemary, and David and Avner go back to childhood, so we also have a big span historically. And there's Michael Nutkiewicz, who we met in the first week at UCLA in 1973, and he's in Albuquerque, and Jody Hirsch in Milwaukee, who we met maybe on the second week at UCLA in 1973. So it's a wonderful gathering here, and there's a lot of you who probably know each other from other events in the Bay Area Jewish community. So we are really thrilled to be able to offer this to the community and to invite all of you to get engaged in many ways. First of all, sign up for the programs. Tell your friends to sign up for the programs. In the fall, and perhaps in the future, we don't know yet, all the programs, with the exception of the language courses and the Talmud circles, are free. And of course, we would be thrilled and feel like the work is valued if people are moved to make donations. If you are interested in making a donation, you can go on our website and click on the donate button, and it'll give you instructions. It's a little complicated right now because we are under fiscal sponsorship by an organization in Los Angeles until our paperwork is approved by the IRS. And any of you who have dealt with the IRS know that that can be a long journey. But it will happen, and any donations are completely tax deductible. I also want to let you know.
So, excuse me, you can go on our website where it says donate, and there are instructions there.
Right. And if you go on our website, you can see all the listings for the fall programs. And if you scroll way to the bottom of the page, you can get a preview of what we are going to offer in the winter and the spring. And here's the best part. In about 3 or 4 weeks, there will be a brand new website that actually looks better and works better. Because this website, if you have gone to it, or if you will go to it, with all due modesty, I built it, and I don't know anything about building websites other than following the simple instructions. So it's going to be much, much better, much easier to register for programs, etc. You might notice at the bottom of your screen that there is a transcription. One of the things we're committed to is reaching as diverse a population as possible in our community, so that includes people with disabilities. So there are people with some hearing limitations. They can read the transcript. And there are some people in our audience with some visual limitations. So we're going to start by describing ourselves. I'm Rachel Biel. I somehow by some miracle of nature, even though I'm way more than a middle-aged Jewish woman, still have curly brown hair. I'm wearing a reddish pinkish scarf, and I'm sitting with in our study with a lot of books, most of them in Hebrew, behind me. And next to me is David Beal, and it's not a coincidence that we have the same last name. And he doesn't have as many curls, less hair, a little bit more gray, but he does have a beard, which I don't. And he's wearing a maroon shirt and a dark green Irish sweater.
It's not a bathrobe
It's
for
not a
anybody.
bathroom. It's a
I'm not in bed yet.
right. Now, next in 2 weeks, when we teach the next session, we will actually be in New York. So it'll be 10 o'clock for us at night. So we might teach from bed, and you're welcome to learn from bed. So the only last thing I want to say is to encourage you to subscribe to our website. That way you will get notices that we will send, and we promise not to send more than 2, at most 3 a month. You're not going to get 3 messages a week. And to, as I said, look at the other programs that are available. This week is the first week that the ongoing courses have launched, and there are many more programs coming. And you can sign up for all of them. In the fall, we managed to arrange it in such a way that there's no 2 programs at the same time, so you can attend all of them. And if you do, you'll get some kind of a reward, probably expecting you to do the same in the winter, so be careful. All right, so with that, have I said anything?
Yeah.
Everything?
Yeah, so I think this is a good time to start on our subject. We will explain the title in just a moment. This is obviously a very large subject, and we're going to, because each session is an hour and 15 minutes, and there are only 4, we will only be touching on many of the topics. So at the risk of shameless self-promotion, I want to refer you to 2 books here, Eros and the Jews, which I wrote, and Women in Jewish Law, which Rachel wrote. These books actually have much more information on our subject than we can pack into our sessions.
And all of you should have received the PDF of the text that we'll be reading. You're welcome to preview them in advance, but it's not expected that you would. I don't see anybody under the age of 18, but I should say that I created a cover page that has a somewhat pornographic fresco from Pompeii. It's old, so I figured it's good.
Okay, so just in terms of logistics, the way we want to run the course, we're a group of 21, and so we're going to run this seminar style, which means that we're not going to use the chat. That is, if you want to put something in the chat, that's your business. The chat, when I teach large courses at the university, the chat turns into, like people passing notes. And so eventually I turn it off. But I'm not going to turn it off for this group. But if you do want to contribute to the discussion, ask questions, make comments, then use the raise hand feature, which is in the lower right of the bar where it says reactions. And if you click on that, you'll see raise hand. And that way we can recognize you, and it will do it in the order in which people raise hands. Finally, you're not required to turn your camera on, but it would be nice if more people would, because teaching to a bunch of black rectangles is not quite the same as being in a classroom. So if you don't mind turning your camera on, please do. Okay, so first of all, I want to share with you a text. A text that explains the title of our course. So I'm going to share the screen. It appears in the reader that we sent out, and it explains why this is Torah from the bedroom. One of my favorite texts in the whole Talmud. Rav Kahana lay under the bed of Rav Shemaiah, who was carousing and speaking frivolously with his wife of sexual matters. Afterwards, Shemaiah had intercourse with her. Rav Kahana said to Rav Shmaya, "You appear to me to be like a hungry man who has never had sex before, for you act with frivolity in your lust." Shemaiah said to Kahana, "Are you here? Get out! It is improper for you to lie under my bed." Kahana said to him, "This is a matter of Torah, and I must study." So let's talk about this text for just a moment. It's a pretty funny text, and I don't think we should underestimate the sense of humor of the rabbis. I think they actually intended this to be funny. I think they intended it to be a kind of a warning to overzealous students. But what do we learn from this text about sexuality in, at least in this rabbinic text?
You can manually raise your hand or just unmute yourself and speak up. If it gets too crazy, we'll manage it.
Well, I think the most interesting thing is the whole idea that sex is Torah. It's what a difference from what we hear from Christianity, that sex is sin. This is a whole different point of view.
Right, and that the manner in which you have to learn. I was going to say there were no sex manuals, but later on in the course we'll actually read a kind of a sex manual from the Middle Ages. But you have to learn something, and this is on the same level as studying the laws of Shabbat or Kashrut. This comes in a place in the Talmud where there's a collection of stories sort of on this, kind of on the edge of impropriety, of students hiding in the toilet to see how their masters conduct themselves when they go to the bathroom, because that too is a matter of Torah. There is a proper way to do it, and the student has to learn how. And this, of course, jumping many, many centuries later, becomes a very critical element in Hasidic thought, where every physical, the most mundane of daily acts can be elevated by doing it with the proper intention, by understanding the deeper level at which this little act that you're doing in your daily life actually reflects, connects, and influences the cosmic order.
Yeah, actually, there's a very famous Hasidic saying where the Hasid says that the reason he goes to see his Rebbe is not to learn Torah from him, but to watch him tie his shoes. That is to say, that physical act of tying shoes is Torah. They don't have a similar thing about sex, although hopefully we'll get to it in our course. So there was a hand up here. Michael, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just was noticing that Shemaya's response was not of shame or anything like that. It was just, get out of here.
Yeah. Right. What are you doing in here? The same, by the way, it's the same dialogue actually in the other stories about the disciple in the toilet. What are you doing here? Get out. No, it's a matter of Torah and I must study. Now, in a certain sense, the dialogue between these two captures, I would say, a certain tension in rabbinic culture and in later Jewish culture. That is, on the one hand, between a very open, a pleasurable approach to sexuality. That's the method of the teacher, Shemaiah. And on the other hand, the more restrained view of the student, Kahana. And we're going to see evidence of both of these points of view as we go on.
There are two elements that Kahana questions. One is the frivolous sex talk. That's what he's saying. Is the word to lesaper, to talk, to weave a tale, is used in the rabbinic literature as a euphemism for having sex, but also including in it amorous sexual sex talk.
Yeah, the phrase lesaperi misha in rabbinic Hebrew means to have sexual intercourse with a woman.
So one element is the element of talking during foreplay, and the other element is the intensity of the passion. He says, you act
frivolously.
Frivolously, and no, he says one more thing. Where's the?
Here, you want me to bring the text?
Yeah, bring up the text. I'm blanking out on the word I'm looking for. um,
With frivolity in your lust.
right,
Yeah.
with
Or like a
lust,
hungry man. Yeah.
like a hungry man, right? That's the word I was looking for. So the intensity of the passion is also something that he's troubled with, and he's representing another view, which is that you have to have sex for a variety of reasons that we'll get to later in the course, but you should do it with restraint. You should do it, and in more extreme cases, almost as if you are forced, compelled to, not because you're really having a good time.
Dev?
Dev, go ahead. Unmute yourself and.
Yeah.
So this is Dev's husband, George. So would there be a difference in how this is taught by Sephardic versus Ashkenazi rabbis?
I don't really think so. Not particularly, but it also depends on the period and the place. So, for example, we know that in medieval Spain, both Al-Andalus under Islam, but also Christian Spain, that the attitude towards sexuality, at least in the writings of the poets, seems to have been very open and embracing, at least in what they wrote. We don't know exactly in terms of what they did. But you wouldn't necessarily find that in other places in the Mediterranean, depending on the place and the time. And in terms of Ashkenazi Jews, we'll see more examples of that later on in the course, where we get quite a range of attitudes towards sexuality.
Right. So both Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi Jews are all based their teaching on the Talmud. So that's universal. In the Middle Ages, it begins to take shape in different directions and in very specific locations and related to other movements happening within Jewish life. So just for example, and I think we'll get to it later, Maimonides, not because of his Jewish community, but because how he understands Aristotle, which is his primary philosophical influence, is quite uncomfortable with the celebration of the body. So he's much more restrictive than some of the texts that he inherits from the Talmud. So we'll follow that theme as we go through different periods.
So now what we want to do is we want to spend actually a fairly short amount of time on the Bible, which obviously we could spend the whole course on the Bible. But what we want to look at here, and it's in the texts in front of you. We're not going to actually read these texts. We're going to paraphrase them because they're quite long. But of course, as you're all well aware, the Bible, in the very first chapter of Genesis, when God creates the man and the woman in the image of God, he says, be fruitful, or I shouldn't say he, because if the image of God is both male and female, then
you should say they.
They.
It's totally au courant.
Right. They create human beings, and they say to them, be fruitful and multiply. And in the Bible, this is a blessing. To be later in Rabbinic Judaism, as we'll see, it becomes a commandment. But in biblical culture, it's a blessing. And it's a blessing because there are many stories, I'm sure you're well aware of this, especially in the book of Genesis, of repeated cases of infertility on the part of women. And only because of divine intervention do women like Sarah and Rebecca and so forth become pregnant. So fertility is a problem in biblical culture. Now, that doesn't mean that they were infertile. It just means that this is, from a cultural point of view, an issue that they are struggling with, fertility. And I think the reason has to do with the fact that Israel is a very small nation originally. And so, like with modern nations, increasing the population is very important.
Just like it is in Israel today.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed.
Right. So, so you have this blessing of fertility, but you also have, of course, in the book of Leviticus in particular, a long list of sexual prohibitions. Prohibitions against homosexuality, which we're going to look at later on. prohibitions against incest spelled out in great detail, prohibitions on sexual relations during a woman's menstrual period. There are all these prohibitions. Adultery, the sexual prohibitions against adultery. So we have all these prohibitions. But then, and this is what we want to focus on for just a few minutes, we have a series of stories in the Bible that feature sexual transgressions in the service of fertility. The first story is the story of Lot, who, Abraham's cousin, who he and his daughters are the only ones who survive the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The wife turns around and is turned into a pillar of salt. They are the only three left alive. As far as they know, there's no one else left alive in the world. And so one of the daughters gets Lot, her father, drunk, has sexual relations with him.
I might add that they escape with their lives and some wine.
And some wine, right? So they evidently raided the cellars there of Sodom and Gomorrah. And she gets her father drunk. She gives birth to a child born of incest. This will be the father of the Moabites.
And she gets her sister to do the same the next night. Get him drunk, have sex with him while he is inebriated, and she becomes pregnant.
And gives birth to Ammon, the ancestor of the Ammonites. These are two nations that border ancient Israel to the east. They are at certain points enemies. At other points, they're conquered by King David. They're actually brought into the Davidic Empire. So here we have a sexual transgression in order to promote fertility. But you might say, okay, well, these are foreign nations. This is a piece of propaganda by a biblical author against these people to say, you see, these people are born of incest, so they couldn't really be legitimate peoples. But then we go on, not much later in the book of Genesis to chapter 38, where we have this fantastic story of Judah and Tamar. So we'll paraphrase the story instead of reading it. But you have it in your
okay.
reader.
So very briefly, skipping over some of the details, Tamar is married off to one of Judah's sons.
Oldest son.
To his oldest sons, he dies. That's another theme, by the way, of husbands who die very easily, like in the book of Ruth. There's actually a meta connection between this story and the story of the book of Ruth in the terms of the untimely death of the husbands. He dies. His brother is supposed to marry her according to the laws of levirate marriage so that his deceased brother's name does not disappear. He doesn't want to do so he's supposed to have sex with her and impregnate her. He doesn't want to do that because he doesn't want his seed to be named after his deceased brothers, and he ejaculates outside the vagina, and he's killed by God because that's a transgression. And then there's one more brother, Nebuch. He's a young guy, and nothing is happening. There's no marriage, there's no prospect. Tamar gets fed up because she's now a widow twice and has had no children. She disguises herself as a prostitute, and lo and behold, Judah happens to pass by, and he approaches her, sleeps with her. She gets pregnant. She wisely asks for a token of his appreciation because he's going to send her a kid, not a child, a goat, in payment. And she says, okay, until then, give me something. He gives her staff. He has proof that it was him. When people start talking and say to him, your daughter-in-law is a prostitute, he sends somebody to look for her. They don't find her, but then when they do identify her, she has proof that the man that she slept with is her father-in-law, and that seems fairly transgressive. And nevertheless, the child that she bears many, many generations later is the forefather of King David.
Right, Peretz is his name, and and he is the direct ancestor of King David. So here we have something quite remarkable, and that is that a sexual transgression, and this really is a sexual transgression, it's violation of the laws of incest, is necessary to promote fertility, and not just any fertility, but the fertility that will lead to the line of David.
And then in the book of Ruth, there's not incest, but there is still a breaking down of the expected rules of behavior where Ruth, who is a Moabite, by the way, so that's a whole other issue, because
So that connects back to Lot. She's a Moabite.
She goes to, as those of you remember the book of Ruth, goes to harvest the
Barley.
wheat and barley that falls off when the harvester comes through, and then at the engineered by her mother-in-law, she goes to the threshing ground at night and essentially seduces, if you read between the lines, seduces Boaz, who is a relative, so that he will marry her and essentially perform this duty of levirate marriage because her husband had died. And she too is the 444 mother of King David. So this is another way of coming to that same line.
Boaz is a descendant of Peretz. So,
Exactly.
Exactly.
So
That's
it's
how the
another way
connection.
of mapping onto
Yeah,
that
they said it could
line
be either way.
of King David. So again, there's this question of sexual behavior. There's also the fact that she's not a Judean, not a Hebrew. She's a Moabite. So there's this amalgam of transgressive behavior that leads to the birth of the greatest king in the history of, at least the way the Bible perceives it, the greatest king in the history of
So
Israel.
we have a question now. Yes, the
Yeah.
name is Tom Frankel, but you were obviously not Tom.
I'm not.
Not
I'm Valda. I'd like to put in a
Okay.
word for Tamar. In actuality, it is not Tamar who transgresses, it is Judah, because he
Yeah.
would not give her his youngest son because he's afraid that his youngest son would also die. So
Yeah.
he
Correct.
sends her back to her father, and then
Right.
indeed she has to pretend that she's a prostitute, etc. So the transgression is Judah's, not Tamar's.
Absolutely. That's
Absolutely.
absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. In fact, Tamar is probably a Canaanite. I mean, this is a separate matter. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of marriage between Israelites and the various Canaanite nations, even though the book of Deuteronomy says that it's forbidden to marry the 7 nations of Canaan. But there's so much evidence of such intermarriage that too can be seen as, it wasn't seen as a transgression, but in a later biblical law, it is a transgression. And finally, I think that the final transgression that we might mention here is David himself. He commits adultery with Bathsheba. They have a child who dies, but then he marries her. He has her husband murdered at the front. He, by the way, is a Hittite, another one of the nations of Canaan. And then they have a child, and that child is King Solomon. So we have these sexual transgressions, one after the other. And the question is, why does the biblical narrative stand in such tension with biblical law? Any thoughts on this?
it strikes me that this unfolds as it's part of the nation of our, it's cosmic, it's history. And if it weren't for these little things, the whole history, the family story would have gone in the wrong direction. So it's a kind of correction.
Could I take your point one step further and say that there is, and psychologize it a little bit, but a national psychology. So there's a kind of a national identity of this nation that sees itself as not totally legitimate. And that ties back to, not that we can take any of the biblical stories of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan as historical, but it doesn't matter. That's the story they told themselves about themselves. In an ancient Near East environment where other nations' stories about themselves was, we've always been here. We have grown from the earth just like the trees and the rocks. Whereas the Israelites have this self-story about being outsiders, not really being from here, and conquering the land, taking this land by force that was not theirs. So there's a kind of a sense of transgression in the national biography of the people of Israel, which is mapped onto the individual biographies of the progenitors of the nation.
Avner?
I was wondering if there's a relationship at all to the mythology of the surrounding peoples, where the gods were always committing sexual transgressions, and sort of this, like in the Greek gods or the Babylonian gods, and now this is being transposed onto the human plane.
Well, that's right. And I think that the way the Bible deals with this is by claiming that if you worship a foreign god, it is like having sex with that god. It is adultery. Idolatry and adultery are the same thing, especially in the biblical prophets. So yes, they take it out of the heavens and they put it here, and they turn it into idolatry.
Because of course the insistence that there's only one God, which is in process in the early biblical books. It's not totally clear in the early biblical books, but it's a work in progress, monotheism. Once you really commit to monotheism, you've got a problem. There's all these fabulous stories, which people like to hear and tell, and you can't tell those about the gods anymore because there's only one God, and you can't ascribe those kind of human-like passions and jealousies and rages to that God. Well, rage, yes, I take that back. Plenty of rage. But those infidelities and temptations and all of that, so you pull it into the human realm.
Yes, Varda, is it, or Tom?
Yeah, I was wondering too if the transgressions are all in service of fertility. The very first commandment is be fruitful and multiply. And so the transgressions are actually in the service of having children. And one of those children, of course, is King David. And King David transgressed also in never sleeping with Michal. There was another transgression.
That's also true. That's true. True
Correct.
enough. I think so. I think that the idea is that the blessing is you should be fruitful and multiply, but then they keep running into trouble, and they're not able to. And so in order to do it, you have to transgress. And so these transgressions are in the service of that original blessing. It's a kind of a very paradoxical culture in that sense. Obviously it's been pointed out time and again that one of the great things about the biblical characters is that most of them are quite flawed. David himself, the most important king in all of Israelite history, is a deeply flawed character. So this is a culture that doesn't seem to have any problem writing its history, warts and all, I think would be the expression. This is not a cleaned up history. It's and that reflects, but it may reflect some deeper issues, which Rachel mentioned about ancient Israel being the youngest of nations. So you see time and again that whereas the law of inheritance is that the eldest son should inherit, time and again it's the younger one who inherits, who is preferred by God.
And sometimes with trickery, like in the case of Jacob.
Or Cain, Abel over Cain, right? Jacob over Esau. Isaac over Ishmael, etc., etc. This is a pattern which is not exactly a transgression, but it also may be linked to that. So Ariel?
This is Tippy, actually.
Tippy, please.
I find it interesting that in all the stories you brought, the women are those that make the transgression. I like to see it as women having agency and determining their own fate. But on the other hand, I would say that if men were doing what the ladies did, we would have been probably very upset about it.
Right, but I think you're absolutely right that there is this dual thing of a sense that all these women have agency, much more than we would expect from the overall sense of the patriarchal culture, and this agency is often wrapped up in transgression. And we see this issue of women's agency in the rabbinic texts as well, where there is sometimes deception, trickery, not quite transgression, but certainly deception, which is necessary for women in order to assert their agency.
Okay, Deb?
So I was just wondering, it seems like Judaism in its early years was a lot of it was about distinguishing and making Jewish practices different from what everybody else was doing. So don't cook veal in the mother's milk anymore. That was Abraham. And the modesty laws. It seems like a lot of it was about making Jews behave differently and separating themselves early on from what everybody else was doing. So I'm wondering how much of these practices are, don't kill your children anymore. Don't burn them alive for the sake of the crops. It was about doing
right. So this is correct, I think. But in this desire to distinguish themselves, sometimes they play fast and loose with what the other nations are actually doing. So, for example, we all assume, and we'll come to this later in the course, circumcision is the sign of the covenant, right? It distinguishes the Jews from other nations. But in the biblical times, the only nation that did not practice circumcision in their immediate environs were the Philistines.
Who were not originally Middle Eastern.
They were not Middle Eastern.
They came from the Greek islands. They were foreigners too.
Right. So, and a lot of the claims of that don't do the following things like incest and homosexuality and so don't do them because those are the practices of the Canaanites and the Egyptians. That looks more like propaganda than anthropology. I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of what they describe the Canaanites doing, as far as we know from Ugaritic literature, most of it's not true.
Oh.
Okay, let's
okay, so we need to
was something the Sumerians did, and they did sacrifice their children for crops.
Maybe.
Well, there was a practice of that sort. I mean, I don't want to get into this in great detail because some of it is certainly true, some of it is propaganda. For example, the accusation that the Canaanites had ritual prostitutes, Kadeshot, they weren't ritual prostitutes. They had female priests or priestesses. They did not have ritual prostitutes, and so that's a piece of propaganda. So it's a mixed bag. We want to go on now. Okay, Michelle, go ahead.
Just real quick, I want to suggest in addition to the ideas that have been floating around, I just wanted to suggest one more, which is that one can regard Bereshit, the beginning, actually as a global history, right? A circumscribed world, which the Bible talks about. And one of the things that may be promoted by all this intertribal relationships is that it promotes genetic diversity. Because when you think about all those relationships, they're mixing the genes.
That's right.
Correct.
That's absolutely right. Okay, we would like to fast forward now because our course is very brief. We're going to fast forward to rabbinic material about sexuality. And this appears now page 6 of your reader. I'm going to share the screen so when we read these texts together. Okay, we have to jump ahead here.
Yeah, scroll down on if you're looking at a computer screen.
So, this is a midrash on the book of Genesis. And it says, if it were not for evil desire, man would not build a house, marry a wife, or have children. Now, evil desire here is a translation of a term that I'm sure is familiar to most of you, and that's Yetzer Hara. Yetzer Hara. Yetzer means some kind of an impulse, but here desire is probably the correct translation, even though it's not literally desire, but the sexual drive. The sexual drive is a necessary drive. I mean, Freud actually got this right. That is, the libido is necessary for people to basically create society, but only if it's sublimated. If it's not sublimated and it gets out of control, then it can be a force for evil. So this is a dialectical view that we find in rabbinic culture. They affirm sexuality, and yet at the same time they are hesitant, they are reluctant to endorse it totally. It is not a Yetzer Hatov, a good desire, it is an evil desire. And so this ambivalence is something that we'll see in a number of the texts.
So what these three basic cornerstones, if you will, building a house or home, which by the way in the rabbinic literature they often transpose or superimpose wife and home. So there's a saying by one rabbi who says, I never called my wife, I called her Beiti, my home. So building a home, marrying and having children are the three cornerstones of creating civilization. On a personal level, creating a family and continuity, and on a communal and civil and global level. And what's important to understand is that these three cornerstones, as we'll see in the subsequent texts, apply to men. Women go along for the ride. Women are actually necessary, at least for the last part of having children, but this text is not directed at women. That doesn't mean that the rabbis don't think that women too have a libido or a sexual desire. As we'll see, they recognize that women have sexual desires as well, but in the case of women, there is not this impulse that they see in men, which actually pushes them to go out into the world and get married and build a house and have children.
Yeah, so we'll see this later on. The rabbis see the male sexual drive as assertive, and the female sexual drive, which they recognize, and we'll see the laws of Onah, the sexual rights of women. But they see women's sexual drive as more, I would say, passive or less assertive in any case. Now, we'll see texts on this later on. The rabbis say that men are required to procreate. It is the first commandment. So they take the blessing from Genesis, pru urvu, and they turn it, because it's literally grammatically in the imperative. You should be fruitful and you should multiply. They interpret it now as a commandment. Okay, so every man is commanded to procreate. But then we have this story. In the Babylonian Talmud, Ben Azai, who was a early second century rabbi, says, he who does not procreate is as if you or he shed blood and lessened the divine image. Okay, so this is pretty extreme. It's not just that you violated the law, but it's as if you committed murder, because presumably children that would have been born are not born, and you lessen the divine image because the divine image, of course, is male and female, and so therefore you diminish the image of God, which is expressed in the union of man and woman. The rabbis said to him, there are those who preach well and practice what they preach, those who practice well but do not preach well, but you preach well, but don't practice what you preach. In other words, he takes this hard line on procreation, but it turns out he himself has not had children.
And he's not married.
And is evidently not married. Ben Azai said to them, what can I do since my soul lusts for the Torah? Chashka nafshi b'Torah. My soul lusts for the Torah. The world will have to exist by the hands of others. So how do we understand this text? So the first thing, obviously, is they are using an erotic language to refer to his desire to study Torah. That is, the study of Torah is itself for the rabbis an erotic activity. In a certain sense, you could say a sublimated erotic activity, but it's still an erotic activity. And we'll see later in the course that it exerts such a pull on the rabbis that it really can compete with the desire to be in a full marriage.
So there are many stories which I don't think we have time.
We will read them next time.
Oh, we'll read them.
We'll
next
read
time.
One next time.
I won't tell you what they're about because we're going to read them next time.
We'll see that this becomes a really important issue for the rabbis. But it's also really interesting that they preserve a story about a very important rabbi. Ben Azai is a very, very important rabbi of the early 2nd century, that he is not married. He is like a celibate priest. And so there is an aspect of rabbinic culture, even though it affirms marriage, it affirms sexuality, there's also a corner of the culture that allows for the possibility of what we would call a vow of celibacy in the case of Ben Azai. We'll see examples of that in our last session when we get to Hasidism.
And this is a fairly typical move in the Talmudic text where there's a majority opinion that's the way of the world. And then there's one rabbi, very often a very prominent one, who is the outlier, who is different than everybody else, who is in some ways admired, but don't follow his example because he's out there. He's different than everybody else. So there's Ben Azai, there's Rabbi Eliezer in terms of his views about women studying Torah. These exceptional figures that are there really to teach you that certainly the ordinary rabbi, and the rabbis are really talking to each other. They're not terribly interested in the uneducated people. In fact, they look at them with quite a bit of derision. So all of these discussions are within the rabbinical elite, talking to each other, about each other, obviously primarily men, even though we will see women coming in here and there, and they're trying to create this consensus culture around marriage and procreation, and yet acknowledge this exceptional deviation.
Okay, so to sort of thematize this ambivalence in rabbinic culture between affirming sexuality and being rather hesitant about it, we'll read a text that has to do with sex in Messianic times. So this is a way of the rabbis projecting onto Messianic times what they think would be an ideal world. So let's read this text together. This is actually from the Midrash on Tehillim, on Psalms. and these two texts come one after the other.
Okay. So, we are the one that says Midrash Rabbah, Psalms 146:4. Though there is nothing more strongly forbidden than intercourse with a menstruant, in the time to come, God will permit such intercourse. So the most grievous sexual transgression will be permitted in the time to come, in the Messianic time.
Because this follows an idea that appears in some places in rabbinic literature, that the laws, the halacha, apply only to this world. And in the Olam Haba, in the Messianic world, these laws will be suspended. They will no longer exist. And of course, in 17th century Sabbateanism, the Messianic movement that swept the Jewish world in the 17th and early 18th centuries, they latched upon a statement like this, and they said that they did a kind of midrash on the prayer that God frees the imprisoned, Asurim, Matir Asurim, Matir, he releases the imprisoned. They read it instead, Matir Isurim, he permits the forbidden. That's what the Messiah will do.
Okay, so that's one side. Right after that, in the time to come, sexual intercourse itself would be forbidden. And you should know that this is true, for on the day that the Holy One, blessed be He, appeared on Mount Sinai to give the Torah, He forbade sexual intercourse for 3 days prior to the revelation. Now, since God forbade intercourse for 3 days when He revealed Himself to them for 1 day, in the time to come, when the Shekhinah, God's feminine presence, dwells among them, permanently is added by the editor, permanently, will not intercourse be entirely forbidden? In other words, we will have to be in this constant state of being in the presence of the divine, and therefore will never be allowed to have sex. So these are complete opposites, and the Midrash feels perfectly comfortable collecting these and presenting them to you. They're not really prescriptive for life today, because the Messianic time is not upon us. So a lot of these discussions of what is going to be in the world to come is a kind of a opening to fantasies. It's fantasy land. So one man's fantasy is another one man's nightmare.
Right. So actually it's not clear if this text is, you will have the desire to have sex, but it'll be prohibited, or will there no longer be desire? And there's another text, and I think Brachot, where it says, in the world to come, there will be neither eating nor drinking nor sexual intercourse. So those bodily needs will no longer exist. So that's another possibility. Okay, now we're going to have a bit of change of pace here. We're going to actually do breakout groups so that you can study the next text, which is at the top of page 7. You can study this in Chavruta, and we'll break you up into groups of 3. We have here, let's see, 23. So we'll do 8 groups, I guess. And take about 5 minutes and read this text and discuss what you think it means in terms of what the rabbis think is appropriate sexual practice within marriage. And where is the...
So if any of you are not familiar with breakout groups, what's going to happen...
I can't find it.
Is maybe we'll not be able to find it.
I can't find
it. In which case it's no action.
Wait a second.
No
Let me
reaction.
See. No, it doesn't. This is very interesting. It doesn't appear to have this.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's very interesting. We have to find out why not. Well, we can't do
anti-Semitism.
For sure it's anti-Semitism. But
look under participants.
Let's see if there's any. No, this is very interesting. I've been teaching for more than 1.5 years on Zoom, and I've never seen a Zoom that doesn't not allow breakout rooms. We'll have to figure out what that is and solve that problem.
We'll do it next time.
All right, so in that case, we'll read this together. This is a text that appears in the tractate Nidarim, Vows, of the Babylonian Talmud.
Okay. Rabbi Yochanan ben... You want to see if somebody else wants to read?
Somebody else want to read?
Does somebody want to read out loud?
If we can't do Chavruta, somebody else can read. Jody. Unmute.
Unmute yourself.
What a good idea. Always telling my students to unmute. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan ben Dakbai said, the ministering angels told me 4 things. People are born lame because their parents overturned their table, dumb because they kiss that place, deaf because they converse during intercourse, blind because they look at that place. Rabbi Yochanan said, the above is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Dakbai, but our sages said the halacha is not as Rabbi Yochanan, but rather A man may do whatever he pleases with his wife. A woman once came before the rabbi and said, Rabbi, I have set a table for my husband, but he has overturned it. Rabbi replied, my daughter, the Torah has permitted you to him. And what can I do for you?
Hey,
Okay, so this is a great text. First of all, what is the status of Yochanan ben Dabbai's statement?
what's his source?
Some angel told him something.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Exactly. He has a special line to the angels, and they tell him all kinds of great wisdom. And of course, those of you who are familiar with rabbinic texts may know the story of Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai, where all of the rabbis are in one camp against one rabbi who they're arguing about a very arcane point of law. And this one rabbi says, who goes against everybody else's opinion, says, if the law is as I say, may the water in this canal go uphill. And it does. And then he says, if they keep arguing, he says, if the law is according to me, I'm abbreviating it, may the wall of the Bet Midrash, of the study house, cave in on themselves, and they start going in, at which point the rabbis shout, and they stop and they go back. And then, so obviously he has access to superpowers, and the rabbis basically say, we don't listen to a voice from heaven. The Torah has been given to us, lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in the heaven, it's here, and it's our place to interpret it and to decide what it means. So that's a foundational text, which plays a role here in the sense that he has knowledge that comes from heaven, not directly from God, okay, from God's ministers, from the angel Malachi Asharet, but nevertheless, it's a divine revelation, and the majority opinion says, well, we don't accept it.
Well, except that here, it's interesting because usually in a halachic dispute, you will have one rabbi who is in a minority position. He will state his view of the halakha, and then the majority will state what their view is. But in this particular case, by quoting the Malachi Asharet, the so-called angels that serve God, it's actually a way of saying this isn't even halachic at all. This is folklore, or this is folk medicine. That it's, how do we know if a child is born with a disability? How do we explain the disability? It must have something to do with the way in which the parents had sex. And this is a very, very common folk belief in many, many cultures, and including in Jewish culture.
And of course, very troubling, not so much because of the sexual practices, but because of the social, psychological need to blame the parents for disability. So it certainly would not be socially acceptable today, but this urge to find an explanation for a child being born with a disability or a deformity is very powerful, and the tendency to make it punitive, it's a punishment to the parents of something they did, is clearly the operating principle here. There's a whole background of a general sort of folkloric notions that the outcome of a child, how the child will turn out, is influenced by how the parents went about having sex, what they talked about. During the pregnancy, if a woman goes by and sees a certain image, that might affect the child. There's a beautiful passage about Rabbi Yochanan, who was reputed to be particularly beautiful. So women would go to look at him before they had sex with their husbands in order to conceive and bear a beautiful child. I think they're also trying to get turned on, but that's a different story. But this idea that something that you look up at right before conception or during pregnancy influences what the child would be like is very popular in many cultures.
So here we have then four sexual practices that Yochanan ben Nabai says will cause you trouble. And the first is overturning the table. What does that mean?
Anal intercourse.
So that's one possibility, although I think that that's probably not what it is. Because the table, I think you have to visualize this. Table has four legs, right? So if it was anal intercourse, then the table would still remain in place if the table is the woman.
And furthermore, if it was anal intercourse, it wouldn't affect the child because there would be no child.
Oh, good point. I withdraw that suggestion. Okay, it's a doggy style.
Okay,
that's a possibility.
One possibility. But what about the turning of the table?
That is, if the man is the table, his two.
So the man is the table?
I think the man is the table. The man is the table,
and the woman on top.
I think that's what it is. I mean, this is open to speculation, right? It doesn't tell you.
So that's that was the transgression of Lilith, who wanted to be on top.
Yes, and we'll come to her story later in our course.
Right.
Exactly. But that's probably what it is. We don't know for sure. I mean, there are discussions actually of anal intercourse elsewhere in the Talmud in which they say Jews don't do that, even though they probably did.
Right.
So that's the way the Goyim have sex, but the Jews don't do this.
But one way or the other, it's an irregular or non-normative sexual position.
And then there's two references to that place, Oto HaMakom. Okay, now it doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out what this is. This is obviously the woman's vagina. Now, now that you know this, as many of you out there are aware, Lerhas Judaica changed its name to Hamakom before it went under in June.
So now you know what it means.
Now you know what Hamakom actually means.
The place, if it's vagina.
It also means God, actually, Hamakom, right.
Yeah.
So we have then oral sex, talking during intercourse, and we'll see.
And looking at the genitals.
And looking at the genitals.
So all forms of what we would call foreplay or sexual arousal that clearly, according to the sages, are all permitted.
It's all permitted. Not only is it all permitted, but because the text here has laid it out in the form of Yochanan ben Nabai's medical knowledge, then any reader of the Talmud will learn how to have sex in different ways by reading this text. Now, it's very interesting. A woman, we're told, comes to Rabbi. Rabbi here is Yehuda Nasi, the editor of the Mishnah, so probably the most important rabbinical figure, certainly at the end of the 2nd, early 3rd century. And she says, I've set a table for my husband and he has overturned it. Okay? Again, depending on how we understand the table, who is the table, who is not the table. So what is her complaint here?
You said that she's forced.
Why is she, I mean, is her problem that she doesn't want to do it this way, or that she doesn't think it's proper to do it this way? Michelle?
Or that she is subjugated to her husband's desires. So Rebbe says to her, well, you have to obey him. So it's it's a power issue.
Right. So there certainly seems to be a discomfort. We don't know if it's because she doesn't know if it's allowed and she doesn't want to transgress if it's not allowed, or that she doesn't like it and she wants Rabbi, Judah the patriarch, to tell her husband he can't do it. And he says to her, there's nothing I can do, he's permitted to do that. Now, the sort of thread of thinking that you're picking up, Michelle, is that what if she really doesn't want to do it and he's forcing her to do it? So that, do we have a whole thing about rape, or are we not going to get there?
I don't think we're going to get there.
So I'll give you the less than Reader's Digest summary, which is that rabbinic law recognizes that there's such a thing as rape in marriage, and requires a man to have sex with his wife only if she's willing. And that would apply in this case. So if in this case the woman said, he's making me do it, I really don't want to do it, I'm really uncomfortable, then it would transfer to the category of compulsion and rape, and then he could say to her, he's not allowed to rape you. So then the option would be either to haul him in and tell him he's not allowed to do it, and if he says, I'm going to do it anyway, then to compel him to divorce her. So that would be the possible consequences of a rape in marriage. But the important underlying point is that the rabbis require the woman's consent for sexual relations, both in general as well as in terms of specific nights. So if the woman says, I have a headache, I'm not in the mood, whatever, her husband is not allowed to force her, even though, as we'll see in a minute, he's actually required to have sex for two reasons. One is because he is required to procreate, and maybe that hasn't been fulfilled yet. And second of all, he's required to fulfill her sexual needs, but only with her consent.
Okay, so two more texts, which I think we have time for. Avner?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly ask about the what the angel had said. The angel wasn't really quoting a halakha. The angel was just telling him a bit some natural history. And
right.
So when the rabbis say that's not the halakha, are they saying that natural history might be true but ignore it, or are they saying that natural history is false?
I think the first.
Yeah.
I think the first, and that is, I think probably the culture believed all of these things, but that didn't stop people from doing them, and the rabbis don't prohibit it.
So they're saying, go, you take the risk if you want to.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Great.
And besides natural history, I would say that he's saying, I have a secret. I heard it from upstairs. I'll let you in on it. So there's another layer of sort of authority, not legal authority, but this comes from upstairs.
Okay, so the next text is a text of a woman who actually is considered very prominent and important. Ima Shalom. She has an interesting name, Ima Shalom. That's her name. She is the sister of Rabban Gamliel, who is the Nasi, who is the head of the rabbinic court. And she is the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, one of the most important of the early 2nd century rabbis. And she is asked, why are your children so beautiful? So it follows along this same line of, that there must be something in the way you've had sex that causes your children to be so beautiful. She replied, because my husband converses with me neither at the beginning nor at the end of the night, but only at midnight. Now here, clearly the conversing is having sex, this term lesaper. He does it at midnight. He does it in the middle of the night, at a time when there's no noise from anywhere else. There's no distractions. He would not think of some other woman because he might hear her on the street. And when he converses, he uncovers a handbreadth and covers a handbreadth, and it is as though he were compelled by a demon. In other words, he does it very, very fast. Moreover, he does it, actually, the implication here is that she is clothed. Now, we know actually from Pompeii that, from the house of prostitutes there, that they were clothed. Mm-hmm. So in the Roman Empire, sex was apparently often clothed, and that seems to be because this is in the land of Israel. So she is clothed. Later, though, in Babylonia, the rabbis will say that you should not have sex the way the Persians do, namely clothed, but instead flesh to flesh. It should be, you should be actually naked. So the law actually is very, very different from what we find in this text. Now, Rabbi Eliezer, you see, he's often an extremist in his behavior. In other texts as well, he in fact is that one minority voice in this Oven of Achnai story. So he has sex very, very rapidly, as if he's compelled by a demon. And this is why the children are so beautiful. But as we're going to see in our next session, this is not necessarily recommended by the rabbis, doing it this way. This is a kind of a outlier practice.
It's the counter example to Shemaiah in the very first story of Rav Kahana lying under his bed, where he says, you're talking sex talk, you're very passionate, you're full of lust. This is the counter example.
Yeah. So again, there is this ambivalence in rabbinical culture. There is Shemaiah on the one hand, there's Kahana on the other hand, and on yet a more extreme other hand is Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, let's read the last text. This is a wonderful story that appears in the tractate Sanhedrin.
A man once conceived a passion for a certain woman, and his heart was consumed by his burning desire. His life was in danger. When the doctors were consulted, they said, his only cure is that she shall submit and have intercourse with him. The rabbis replied, let him die rather than she should submit. Then the doctor said, let her stand naked in front of him. The rabbis answered, sooner let him die. Then the doctor said, let her converse with him from behind a fence. So in this case, converse is not have sex, just talk. Let him die, the rabbis replied, rather than she should converse with him from behind a fence.
So, thoughts on this story?
Do we presume this woman was married to someone else?
Exactly. So the first question is, so if he's so in love with her, why don't he just marry her? So we have to presume that she is married to someone else. So it would be a sexual transgression for them to have sex. Unless she doesn't want him.
Or right. In other words, maybe she isn't married. He has an obsession with her. He can't get rid of his obsession. And the rabbis basically say, well, if you can't get rid of your obsession, that's your problem. We're not going to help you out. This is a very, very strange, these kind of stories are actually, I would say, they're erotic stories. That is, even though he's not permitted to do any of these things, we as readers experience his passion, right? And we say, okay, we can't have this woman, but we can read about her and we can imagine her. So we'll see other stories in our course that ostensibly come to put a lid on some kind of eroticism, but in the process of doing so, they actually act as a kind of pornography. So
okay.
We've reached the end of our time. Now let me just say that our next class will be in 2 weeks. Our class meets every 2 weeks. We use the same Zoom link. You don't need to register again. Just keep the Zoom link. We'll probably send out a reminder of the Zoom link to all those who are registered. But we'll simply come on again with the same Zoom link, and we'll continue with women's sexual pleasure, or onah. So are there any questions before we adjourn?
I just will recommend to everyone Machiavelli's play called The Mandragora. Anyway, what's it called? Mandragola. He wrote a play on this theme of the last reading we had, which is
oh really? Oh, I've got to read it.
Very interesting.
Is it on Kindle?
I don't know.
Who knows?
Probably.
And
In
it
the
has to
library.
do- It has to
Okay,
do
we
with
have to,
the mandrake, which is
The Mandrake, right.
right,
Yeah,
the man,
oh,
just like in the
Mandrake.
Jacob
Comedy.
story. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Okay, two questions, then Dev, and then Varda.
So I just had a last thought about going back to the table idea, because in other early writings, the table, like how to set up proper table, was really about proper etiquette or proper behavior. So could it be like
Ah.
inventory for how to do things properly? And she presented her idea of proper, what she wanted, and he said, no, I don't like your table. So that was just
Yeah. Shulchan Aruch, the
Yeah.
great
Yeah,
code of Jewish law, is
yeah,
called the
but
set table.
that's a much later concept.
I don't know. I
don't-
like that
I
interpretation.
love the interpretation. I would like to see a rabbinical text that talks about the proper setting of a table to bolster that argument. So if anybody can find one, that'd be great.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, Varda.
There are three other important transgressions that have not been mentioned. Of course, not all of them can be mentioned. Abraham twice telling Pharaoh that Sarah is not his wife, that she's his sister, and God punishes Pharaoh. But then there's another one when Yitzchak tells Avimelech that Rivka
Avimelech.
is his sister. And then there's a beautiful line, and I can't quote it exactly, but Avimelech sees Yitzchak metzachek im Rivka.
Right.
They're
right,
playing,
right.
they're laughing, and that's a beautiful, tender moment. And he says, why did you tell me she's your sister? She's your wife.
Right.
I just think
Right.
it's a beautiful, very tender
So
sentence.
metzachek, which is probably the same word as mesachek in the biblical parlance, but in modern Hebrew they're different. Metzachek would be laughing, mesachek would be playing around.
But it's a play with
also
Yitzchak.
used-
But it's a
but
play with
both of
Yitzchak.
those words,
Yitzchak metzachek, and Sarah tzachaka when the angels told her that she's going to have a
Right,
child. So I
right.
think it's a play with those words.
it's a play on the name. But my point was that both of those words in the rabbinic idiom become also a euphemism for sexual play.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, wonderful. So I'll see all of you, I hope, in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye bye.